Laura and Serena and the whole team at the Center for Jewish Studies at Duke for having Rafe and myself. It's an honor to be here. I just want to pick up where Rafe left off. As you hear, we're both kind of what I would call gradualists. We both worry that when it's all or nothing in the Mideast, it's always nothing. And therefore, what we would like to see is that there be some practical steps on the ground that would give this sense of dignity for both sides. And we feel you've got to appeal to the guts of the other public. The Israeli side might call it the kishkis of the other side. Because ultimately, as you heard from Rafe, the polling numbers are somewhat mirror images. You've got about half on each side that says, I'm for two states. But then, as you heard from Rafe, but then they said, but is the other side for it? Oh, hell no. Is it going to happen? Never. So the question is, how do you deal with this kind of profound sense of disbelief on both sides? That, I think, is a big question. I think in the case that I wanted to talk about is, what would be, if you can't hit a home run on this issue, and there have been three major efforts. Bill Clinton and Camp David in the last 6 months of his presidency and a couple weeks beyond, in the end of 2000. Condoleezza Rice's effort in 2007-8, the effort I was a part of in 2013-14. Those were the three big efforts to hit a home run on this issue. I think they were noble efforts, but ultimately the Venn diagram on this issue just has not overlapped. There's been differences between leaders. I would say of the five core issues, the borders, the security arrangements, the refugees, Jerusalem, and mutual recognition, the last one being, do you accept the character of the other side's state? In my time, I think each leader was willing to make one big move. And they thought that was the ace in the hole, so to speak. And in return for that one move, they wanted the other four to go their way. In the case of Netanyahu, I think in 2014, he felt, okay, I'm willing to do more than people will ever admit, and I will admit to publicly on land issues, in keeping with what President Obama asked me to do. But in return, I want the other four to go my way. And President Abbas said, look, I'm not stupid. I know that all these refugees are not going back to Israel. They'll go to a Palestinian state, but it would, this he won't say publicly, but it would be politically suicidal for Israel to accept them into Israel. But in return for that one concession of not pressing the refugee issue to its end, and no Israeli wanted any Palestinian to live in a squalor. The issue was they could all move to Palestine, but not to Israel. I want the other four issues my way. So the Venn diagram on these five core issues did not overlap. And so the question is, if you can't hit a home run on this issue, and as you heard from Rafe, you want to reconcile the national movements, two states is the way to do it, but the politics don't allow it. What would be the single? What would be the solid single that would convince each public that you're serious? What's real here? What's practical? So I think what's practical, the solid single in my view, like I said, has to appeal to the kishkas, the guts of the other side. So on the side of the Israelis, it's about terrorism, and it's not just terrorism, but it's legitimacy. Do you accept that the Jews have a right to a state, any state? Do you not want to teach your kids, about that reality, or is it legit to kill? Are they on a map and the like? And that means, I think, will you not pay money to relatives of suicide bombers or other people who perpetrate violence? Because that sends a message it's okay to pay to slay. You've got to somehow deal with that if you want to be a partner. That's something for the Israelis' gut. That's the way to get over that big hump. One thing that's politically, that's hard. And I would say on the Palestinian side, it's land. And I'm not here to say that land and terror are the same, but there's no moral equivalence between a bomb and a bulldozer. But there has to be a sense, if you want me to hit a single and not solve this whole thing at once, I want to know that by deferring an issue, I'm not conceding the issue. How do you do that? And I think that makes sure that you have a settlement policy consistent with the two-state policy. Just this afternoon, we had a statement from Secretary of State Pompeo a little bit on the, but that we can discuss that in the Q&A. I don't want to go there right now. But I would like to say that the consistency would be to say is that you have a settlement policy that's consistent with the two-state solution. Not that you're going to have the two states tomorrow. As Ray said, the Palestinians themselves are divided between Abbas and Hamas, between the West Bank and Gaza. So, you get that, but there has, I have a website which you can look up, it's all free, called Settlements and Solutions. I urge you to look at it, and has aerial photography of 140 settlements, how each settlement voted in the last 4 elections, 560 pie charts. You could look at that. But what you see is where does the settlements and the peace plans intersect. And they all basically come down to the same idea, which is even the Palestinian plans would say, we know some of the settlements are going to be Israel. As Abbas himself said to me personally, and Erica, his chief, his chief negotiator, we understand that 1.9%, which is the offer, is not in the Quran, right? And 6.1, which was offered by Olmert, is not in the Torah. These were ideas that said Israel will keep some settlements, but will have land exchanges, land swaps, as it became to be known. Most of the settlers live in blocks, in clusters, in 8% of the West Bank, inside the security barrier, largely adjacent to Israeli cities. And the point here is 87% of Israelis over the green line, over the 67 line, live in 8% of the land in the security barrier. Now there's 104,000, or basically 13%, if 665,000 people, if you add East Jerusalem and the West Bank, live in these blocks, there are still 13% that do not, and they're scattered all over. So the people say, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Why would you add more people over the barrier in this? Because I'm trying to look at where does demography meet geography in the West Bank. And what you see is this sense of most of them are in the blocks, and you could do a two-state solution within that. You could have these territorial exchanges. But if you build outside that, you're closing the door. So even if you don't have the two-state solution tomorrow, which I don't think you will, but at least you want to say, I want to leave the door open for that possibility in the future. I want to maintain the viability of an idea, and I maintain the viability of the idea by not building outside the barrier. So that's what I think the messaging has to be on the Israel side. The Israelis and the Palestinians each have to take a step. Now I would argue, and I was just in Abu Dhabi last week at a conference of Arab states in the Gulf, and I said something that I didn't know if they wanted to hear, and I was actually pleasantly surprised by their response. And the response was, I said, look, I think there's a role for you too in this conflict. Just as there's been a role for the United States. We've said some tough love in the Obama period, certainly, that people didn't want to hear there. But you need in the Arab world also to have that tough love. But incentivize the parties as they hit the single. What does that mean? Is that for every step that Israel takes towards the Palestinians, you Arab states take a step towards Israel. And this is something that if I would have said it 5 years ago, I would have said, David, you're on drugs. No way. The Arab states don't have anything to do with Israel. But what's happened in the last 5 years, and maybe it's not a headline in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, but what's happened is there's been a strategic convergence between Israel and Arab states. Not necessarily the publics, the governments, because of the concern about Iran, the issue of high tech. I say it's under the table, but it's getting crowded under the table to the point that the table is starting to levitate. And this creates new opportunities that were unthinkable 5 years ago, because the Arab world has got other problems. This issue used to be number 1 on the agenda, and it seems to be number 10 on the agenda now, way down below Yemen, Iran, and some other questions. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think if it's less emotionally driven now in the Arab elites than compared to where it was 5 years ago, that could be a room for hope. What do I want in particular? I want to create political space in both Israeli and Palestinian communities. And I think the Arab governments have a chance to make that effort to create the space. Because by saying we're going to incentivize, you take a step towards the Palestinians, we'll take a step towards you. What could that step be? Could it be opening trade missions, consulates in Israel, all sorts of things. But you want this new outreach between Israel and the Arab governments not to be a bypass around the Palestinian issue, but to be a bridge, because each side wants the Arab states to play a role. And so I think there's an opportunity here that was not here before, and I was actually very pleased by the response that I received at this conference last week. So I'd like to add one more element to it, the mix, and that is just the need for leadership on this issue. And there's no way of getting around it. Rafe mentioned it in his remarks. Israel is at a flux point. We don't know when that's weird. Literally, the next 48 hours could be very key in these coalition talks. Gantz, who's the leader of the centrist forces there, but he comes out of the same school that Rafe spoke about, which is the military. And I know in some places when you hear military, you think militaristic. Except in this conflict, the military are the pragmatists. They're often the centrists because they know what's actually going on the ground, and they don't feel Israel has the luxury to engage in some of the settlements outside the barrier. They're looking for accommodation to lower the threshold, to lower the chance of renewed conflict. There's been 3 rounds between Israel and Gaza in the last few years. And they understand that security is their job, and some of the ideological approach doesn't help them. Is Gantz another Rabin? I would be cautious there, only in the sense that Rabin won the 1967 war. You don't have too many people that win the Six-Day War, and that gave him a street cred in terms of dealing with having to do a land for peace arrangement. But Gantz brings a lot of those same people of the pragmatic security establishment who would come into office with him, who were looking for win-win solutions. I think who want to hit singles. And so I think we're in an interesting time. We don't know if it'll happen in 48 hours. There's actually a 21-day kind of political overtime period built into the law that they could still work something out, or else, God forbid, there's a third election in Israel. I say Israel likes to say it's the only democracy in the Middle East, but this is getting ridiculous to have 3 elections in a row. So we will have to see how this plays out. But leadership is central. Look, I wrote this book with Dennis Ross on trying to inspire people, and I hope those of you read it will feel inspired. It's understand of leaders who met the bar of history, who really understood that if you're going to take tough decisions, it's going to require also political courage to make those tough decisions. You have to go against longtime political allies. Not easy. But people could get very despairing. They kind of think, well, the leaders today, or whatever I might think, the problems are just too big for them. They can't deal with it. It's too hard. So what we want to say is there were leaders who met the bar of history, and we want you to engage in their journeys. And what was it like for them to make this decision? And we wrote about 4. And you say, well, is there a commonality between the 4? The commonality between the 4, as I see it, is that they all believe country first. And if the country's interest and the personal interests were at odds, the country's interest came first. They believed that they had no right to defer tough issues to their children, that they had to solve problems to the extent they could now. And they understood something I think very important, that when you think about the risks of action, you have to weigh that against the risks of inaction. What if I don't decide? In the case of Begin, for example, on the peace with Egypt, which has withstood the test of 40 years, including the death of Sadat, the assassination of Sadat, 2 wars in Lebanon, 2 intifadas, even the rise briefly of the Muslim Brotherhood. Not a shot's been fired between Egypt and Israel. And once Egypt came out of the war coalition, the wars of 48, 56, 67, 73 melted away. Doesn't mean there's not Hamas, there's not Hezbollah, but so far, at least until now, they don't have air forces, they don't have tanks. Being a non-state actor is not the same as being a state actor. Of course, they're not Iran, they're Persians, but the immediate neighborhood that had wars with Israel, suddenly that period is over. And Begin, wasn't easy because it was fresh after the 73 war. And the Sinai was like a buffer between Israel and Egypt, 200 kilometers, and all these wars were fought there. So to give up that strategic depth wasn't easy. To give up the settlements of the northern Sinai wasn't easy. People on the right attacked him. But Begin, who believed, but if we can end the wars between these peoples, that will be a lasting legacy. And if we don't, the risk of inaction, what if we don't try? Then Sadat returns to the rejectionist camp, and there's probably another war. So I think these people were weighing these risks all the time. And so I think when we talk about what can be done now, they're gradual steps, just to summarize, that require political costs from each side, but at least will convince each side that they're a partner, even if you don't hit the home run. And these are very practical steps on the ground. And then there's the need for other players to take action, as I mentioned. And then there's the importance of leadership itself. And we'll see how that plays out. But why people ask me, I'll conclude on this point. People ask me, why did you and Rafe, you go around the country, why do you keep talking about this issue? Because we're worried that it's your generation that gives up first. Because Rafe and I at least saw the 70s, I saw the 70s, I don't know about Rafe, the 80s, the 90s, which was the time of hope, which was the Madrid conference when all sides sat around one table, was the handshake on the White House lawn with Bill Clinton, and then there was the Joint Israel Peace Treaty. I, as a journalist at the time, got to attend all of these things. But we, in this ups and downs of a roller coaster, we got to see the ups. We're worried that this is now a generation born after 9/11, has no memories of 9/11, certainly doesn't remember the 90s. It's ancient history. And so therefore, without any reservoir of memory, our fear is that your generation gives up first. And therefore, our message is to tell people, we actually saw the good times. And we think there are gradual steps that could be done. There's steps that you don't see day in, day out of the security systems working together, day in, day out now, 2019. And we think this can be broadened. So our message to you is not to give up, not to throw in the towel, and to do what's possible to, even if you can't hit the home run, at least hit the solid single. Thank you all very much.